Jim was 5 years old, sitting in the back of his father's military car on a New Mexico highway, when the truck in front of them swerved off the road and overturned, scattering Native American workers across the asphalt like broken dolls. What happened next haunted every song Morrison would write for the next 24 years of his life, and left his father speechless when young Jim screamed, "Stop the car, they're dying." August 1949, Highway 66, New Mexico desert. The morning sun was blazing through the car windows. Jim's father, Navy Commander George Morrison, was driving his family to their new posting in California. Jim's mother, Clara, sat in the passenger seat. His younger brother, Andy, was asleep beside him. Then came the crash. The pickup truck carrying Pueblo workers to a construction site hit loose gravel, flipped 3 times, and bodies flew through the air. Jim pressed his face against the rear window and saw them scattered on the road, blood on the sand, men writhing. One elder lying perfectly still, eyes open, staring directly at Jim. But what none of them knew was that Commander Morrison had orders not to stop for civilian accidents. Military protocol: keep the convoy moving. So 5-year-old Jim watched those dying men shrink in the distance while his father accelerated and his mother told him to look away and stop crying. In that back seat, Jim Morrison saw death for the first time. Not peaceful death, not movie death, real death, indigenous death, forgotten death. And according to Morrison himself in a 1969 interview, one of those dying men's souls jumped into his body that morning. The most important moment of my life, he called it. Jim's grandmother Flora heard about the incident weeks later, when Jim wouldn't stop drawing pictures of the bleeding Indians in his notebooks. "That boy's been touched by something dark," she told Clara. "You watch, those ghosts will follow him forever." She was right. Every Doors song about death, about spirits, about the end, traced back to that August morning on Highway 66 when Jim was 5. If you want to understand how this childhood trauma shaped every song Morrison ever wrote and discover the hidden connections in the Doors' music, subscribe to our channel. Every week we reveal the untold stories behind rock's greatest mysteries. Highway 666, the Devil's Highway, ran through New Mexico's high desert, connecting military installations. In August 1949, the Morrison family was part of a military convoy heading west. Commander Morrison had just received orders to report to Naval Air Station Alameda in California, the same officer who would later become Rear Admiral and command naval forces during the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. He was by the book, not a man who broke protocol, not even for dying strangers on a desert highway. The accident happened around 9 in the morning when an old Ford pickup carrying 6 or 7 Pueblo workers hit loose gravel on a curve. The driver overcorrected, and the vehicle rolled. No seatbelts, no roll bar. Just men and metal tumbling across the desert floor. Jim Morrison had a direct view through the rear window. He saw everything: the overturned truck with wheels still spinning, the scattered bodies. One man crawling off the road, another sitting up, blood streaming down his face, and the elder, lying on his back 20 feet from the truck, perfectly still except for his eyes. Those eyes were open, locked onto the passing cars, locked onto the little boy staring back. Morrison later described those eyes as ancient and knowing, as if the dying man was transferring something, imprinting something onto the child who witnessed his final moments. Commander Morrison did not stop. He accelerated, keeping pace with the convoy. Clara Morrison turned and told Jim to close his eyes, to think about something else. But Jim couldn't look away. He pressed his face against the glass and watched the bodies become dots on the horizon, watched the desert swallow what he had just witnessed. He was screaming, crying, begging his father to turn around. Commander Morrison said nothing. He just kept driving. Morrison told the story of Highway 666 dozens of times throughout his life, but not as a simple childhood trauma. He told it as a spiritual experience, as the moment his identity fundamentally changed. In a 1969 interview, Morrison explained his belief that one of the dying Indian souls left his body at death and entered Jim's through their locked eye contact. Morrison described feeling a sudden weight in his chest, as if something had moved into him and never left. He believed he was carrying the spirit of a dead Pueblo elder, and that this spirit influenced everything he created. This belief in shamanic possession became central to Morrison's self-mythology. He read extensively about indigenous spirituality, about the ghost dance movement, about the relationship between death and artistic creation. Morrison saw himself as a ghost dancer, channeling voices of the forgotten dead, giving form to spirits that mainstream culture had tried to erase. Whether this was genuine belief or poetic metaphor is impossible to know, but Morrison lived as if it were absolutely real. The psychological impact was profound. Child psychology research shows that traumatic death exposure, especially with parental dismissal of emotional response, creates lasting dissociation, survivor guilt, and obsessive preoccupation with mortality. Morrison exhibited all these patterns. He frequently dissociated, seemed to leave his body. He carried guilt about privilege and power, constantly referencing his military background with shame and anger. And he was obsessively, relentlessly focused on death as a subject, as a presence, as the ultimate truth hiding behind everyday life. 3 songs most directly connect to the Highway 666 incident: The End, Riders on the Storm, and Peace Frog. The End began as a simple breakup ballad in 1966, but evolved into something darker during live performances. Morrison would extend it to 20 or 30 minutes, improvising verses about ritualistic death and spiritual transformation. He described it as a shamanic journey, a confrontation with the death he witnessed as a child. Ray Manzarek said Morrison would enter a trance-like state during performances, his eyes changing, his voice dropping into impossible registers, as if channeling something beyond himself. People felt they were witnessing something sacred and terrifying. Riders on the Storm was the last song Morrison recorded before leaving for Paris in 1971. The lyrics describe a killer on the road, danger lurking in every passing vehicle, a storm that never stops. The song's atmosphere directly echoes the helplessness Morrison felt, watching death unfold on the highway. The storm isn't just weather, it's the randomness of mortality, the way death arrives without warning. Morrison's vocal is subdued, almost whispered, as if afraid to speak too loudly about the truth he's revealing. The song was playing on rock radio when news of Morrison's death was announced in July 1971. The synchronicity haunted everyone who had worked on it. Peace Frog contains Morrison's most direct lyrical reference to Highway 666, though most listeners miss it. The song describes blood on various streets and highways across America. One verse specifically mentions blood on the desert highway, Indians scattered on the Dawn Highway, a direct nod to 1949. The song juxtaposes these death images with references to peace and love, creating uncomfortable tension that reflected Morrison's view of America as a nation built on forgotten bloodshed, on erased indigenous lives, on violence disguised as progress. Have you ever considered how much of the music you love might be rooted in childhood trauma you never knew about? Commander George Morrison never publicly acknowledged the Highway 666 incident. When Jim became famous and told the story in interviews, George dismissed it as exaggeration or fantasy. He maintained no such accident occurred during their 1949 journey, that Jim was conflating different memories. This paternal denial deepened Jim's trauma, making him question his own memories, while simultaneously insisting on their truth. This is gaslighting, where an authority figure convinces someone their lived experience didn't happen. It contributed to Morrison's lifelong estrangement from his father. The Unknown Soldier, recorded in 1968, addressed Morrison's complicated feelings about military culture and his father's career. While ostensibly protesting Vietnam, it also contains Morrison's anger at military protocols that prioritize orders over human compassion. The line about making a grave for the unknown soldier can be read as Morrison creating a memorial for the unnamed Pueblo workers his father refused to acknowledge. In one of Morrison's last interviews before Paris, conducted in March 1971, he said, "My father taught me that some people's lives don't matter enough to even slow down for. That's America's original sin, and I've been trying to exorcise it ever since." Morrison understood the incident not just as personal trauma, but as a microcosm of larger historical violence, the genocide and erasure of Native Americans. His guilt was both personal and historical, and his art became an attempt at reparation, at keeping the dead remembered. The Paris connection. When Morrison arrived in Paris in March 1971, he told friends he was going there to write poetry and escape rock star machinery. But he also said something stranger. He was going to Paris to die, that he had seen his death approaching and wanted to meet it in a city that understood poets and ghosts. Morrison's belief in death's proximity had been with him since age 5, and by 27, he seemed convinced his borrowed time was ending. Morrison spent his final months visiting cemeteries, particularly Père Lachaise, where he would soon be buried. He told Pamela he felt most at home among the dead, that he had never really belonged to the living world. This wasn't romantic posturing. It was the logical endpoint of a life spent carrying childhood death trauma, of watching men die at age 5 and never fully returning from that moment. On July 3, 1971, Jim Morrison died in a Paris bathtub at age 27. Official cause was heart failure, but no autopsy was performed. Morrison's friends weren't surprised. He had been predicting his early death for years, living as if on borrowed time, waiting for the spirits to call him home. In a letter found in his Paris apartment, Morrison had written, "I'm finally going back to the highway. The old man is waiting for me. We have unfinished business." The Highway 6066 incident raises uncomfortable questions about cultural appropriation. White artists using indigenous spirituality for their own purposes. Morrison never profited the Pueblo community in documented ways. He never used his platform to advocate for Native American rights in sustained fashion. He took the image of the dying Indian and made it central to his mythology, but didn't give back to living indigenous people still facing poverty and discrimination. This is a valid criticism of Morrison's legacy. At the same time, Morrison's work kept alive a memory of violence most Americans preferred to forget. His songs reminded listeners that American highways were built through indigenous lands, that progress had a body count, that ghosts of the conquered were still present. He wasn't just exploiting indigenous imagery for shock value. He was genuinely haunted by what he witnessed. Today, psychologists recognize that childhood exposure to traumatic death, especially when adults refuse to acknowledge the child's emotional response, creates lifelong PTSD, dissociation, and complicated grief. Morrison exhibited all these symptoms. His substance abuse, risk-taking behavior, obsession with death, feelings of possession by outside forces, all consistent with unresolved childhood trauma. If Morrison had lived in an era with better mental health resources, if his family had acknowledged what he witnessed and helped him process it, his life might have unfolded very differently. The Doors' music remains powerful more than 50 years after Morrison's death because it touches something primal and universal: the fear of death, the weight of witnessing violence, the search for meaning in a world indifferent to suffering. Morrison took his Highway 66 trauma and transformed it into Riders on the Storm, into The End, into Peace Frog, into songs that continue to resonate because they speak truth about the darkness we all carry. Whether the Pueblo elder's spirit actually entered Morrison's body that August morning is ultimately unknowable. What we do know is that something profound happened to 5-year-old Jim Morrison on that highway, something that shaped every song he would write, every performance he would give, every line of poetry he would create. The dying man's eyes never left him. The highway never ended, and Jim Morrison spent his entire life trying to understand what it meant to be marked by death before he even understood what life was.